Why not, Paganel, if it would give you any pleasure? Done, Major, exclaimed Paganel. You may say goodbye to your rifle, for it will never shoot another chamois or fox unless I lend it to you, which I shall always be happy to do by the by. And whenever you require the use of your telescope, Paganel, I shall be equally obliging, replied the Major gravely. Let us begin then, and ladies and gentlemen, you shall be our jury. Robert, you must keep count. This was agreed upon, and Paganel forthwith commenced. Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, chaste mother of the muses, he exclaimed, inspire thy faithful servant and fervent worshipper. 258 years ago, my friends, Australia was unknown. Strong suspicions were entertained of the existence of a great southern continent. In the library of your British Museum, Glenarvan, there are two charts, the date of which is 1550, which mention a country south of Asia, called by the Portuguese Great Java. But these charts are not sufficiently authentic. In the 17th century, in 1606, Quiros, a Spanish navigator, discovered a country which he named Australia de Espiritu Santo. Some authors imagine that this was the New Hebrides group and not Australia. I am not going to discuss the question, however. Count Quiros, Robert, and let us pass on to another. 1, said Robert. In that same year, Louis Vasse de Tours, the second in command of the fleet of Quiros, pushed further south. But it is to Theodore Hertoge, a Dutchman, that the honor of the great discovery belongs. He touched the western coast of Australia in 25 degrees latitude and called it Eendracht after his vessel. From this time, navigators increased. In 1618, Zeechen discovered the northern parts of the coast and called them Arnheim and Diemen. In 1618, Jan Edels went along the western coast and christened it by his own name. In 1622, Lewin went down as far as the Cape, which became his namesake. And so Paganel continued with name after name until his hearers cried for mercy. Stop, Paganel, said Glenarvan, laughing heartily. Don't quite crush poor McNabbs. Be generous. He owns he is vanquished. And what about the rifle? Asked the geographer triumphantly. It is yours, Paganel, replied the Major, and I am very sorry for it, but your memory might gain an armory by such feats. It is certainly impossible to be better acquainted with Australia. Not the least name, not even the most trifling fact. As to the most trifling fact, I don't know about that, said the Major, shaking his head. What do you mean, McNabbs? Exclaimed Paganel. Simply that perhaps all the incidents connected with the discovery of Australia may not be known to you. Just fancy, retorted Paganel, throwing back his head proudly. Come now, if I name one fact you don't know, will you give me back my rifle? Said McNabbs. On the spot, Major. Very well, it's a bargain then. Yes, a bargain, that's settled. All right, well now, Paganel, do you know how it is that Australia does not belong to France? But it seems to me. Or, at any rate, do you know what's the reason the English give? Asked the Major. No, replied Paganel with an air of vexation. Just because Captain Baudin, who was by no means a timid man, was so afraid in 1802 of the croaking of the Australian frogs that he raised his anchor with all possible speed and quitted the coast, never to return. What? Exclaimed Paganel. Do they actually give that version of it in England? But it is just a bad joke. Bad enough, certainly, but still it is history in the United Kingdom. It's an insult, exclaimed the patriotic geographer, and they relate that gravely. I must own it is the case, replied Glenarvan, amidst a general outburst of laughter. Do you mean to say you have never heard of it before? Never, but I protest against it. Besides, the English call us frog-eaters. Now, in general, people are not afraid of what they eat. It is said, though, for all that, replied McNabbs, so the Major kept his famous rifle after all. Chapter 5, The Storm on the Indian Ocean. 2 days after this conversation, John Mangles announced that the Duncan was in longitude 113 degrees 37 minutes, and the passengers found on consulting the chart that consequently Cape Bernouilli could not be more than 5 degrees off. They must be sailing then in that part of the Indian Ocean which washed the Australian continent, and in 4 days might hope to see Cape Bernouilli appear on the horizon. Hitherto the yacht had been favored by a strong westerly breeze, but now there were evident signs that a calm was impending, and on the 13th of December the wind fell entirely. As the sailors say, there was not enough to fill a cap. There was no saying how long this state of the atmosphere might last. But for the powerful propeller, the yacht would have been obliged to lie motionless as a log. The young captain was very much annoyed, however, at the prospect of emptying his coal bunkers, for he had covered his ship with canvas, intending to take advantage of the slightest breeze. After all, though, said Glenarvan, with whom he was talking over the subject, it is better to have no wind than a contrary one. Your lordship is right, replied John Mangles, but the fact is these sudden calms bring change of weather, and this is why I dread them. We are close on the trade winds, and if we get them ever so little in our teeth, it will delay us greatly. Well, John, what if it does? It will only make our voyage a little longer. Yes, if it does not bring a storm with it. Do you mean to say you think we are going to have bad weather? Replied Glenarvan, examining the sky, which from horizon to zenith seemed absolutely cloudless. I do, returned the captain. I may say so to your lordship, but I should not like to alarm Lady Glenarvan or Miss Grant. You are acting wisely, but what makes you uneasy? Sure indications of a storm. Don't trust, my lord, to the appearance of the sky. Nothing is more deceitful. For the last 2 days the barometer has been falling in a most ominous manner, and is now at 27 degrees. This is a warning I dare not neglect, for there is nothing I dread more than storms in the southern seas. I have had a taste of them already. The vapors which become condensed in the immense glaciers at the South Pole produce a current of air of extreme violence. This causes a struggle between the polar and equatorial winds, which results in cyclones, tornadoes, and all those multiplied varieties of tempest against which a ship is no match. Well, John, said Glenarvan, the Duncan is a good ship and her captain is a brave sailor. Let the storm come, we'll meet it. John Mangles remained on deck the whole night, for though as yet the sky was still unclouded, he had such faith in his weather-glass that he took every precaution that prudence could suggest. About 11 p.m., the sky began to darken in the south, and the crew were called up, and all the sails hauled in except the foresail, brigantine, topsail, and jib-boom. At midnight the wind freshened, and before long the cracking of the masts, and the rattling of the cordage and groaning of the timbers awakened the passengers, who speedily made their appearance on deck. At least Paganel, Glenarvan, the Major, and Robert. Is it the hurricane? Asked Glenarvan quietly. Not yet, replied the captain, but it is close at hand. And he went on giving his orders to the men, and doing his best to make ready for the storm, standing, like an officer commanding a breach, with his face to the wind, and his gaze fixed on the troubled sky. The glass had fallen to 26 degrees, and the hand pointed to tempest. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, when Lady Helena and Miss Grant ventured upstairs on deck. But they no sooner made their appearance than the captain hurried toward them, and begged them to go below again immediately. The waves were already beginning to dash over the side of the ship, and the sea might any moment sweep right over her from stem to stern. The noise of the warring elements was so great that his words were scarcely audible, but Lady Helena took advantage of a sudden lull to ask if there was any danger. None whatever, replied John Mangles, but you cannot remain on deck, madam, no more can Miss Mary. The ladies could not disobey an order that seemed almost an entreaty, and they returned to their cabin. At the same moment the wind redoubled its fury, making the masts bend beneath the weight of the sails, and completely lifting up the yacht. Haul up the foresail, shouted the captain, lower the topsail and jib-boom. Glenarvan and his companions stood silently gazing at the struggle between their good ship and the waves, lost in wondering and half-terrified admiration at the spectacle. Just then, a dull hissing was heard above the noise of the elements. The steam was escaping violently, not by the funnel, but from the safety valves of the boiler. The alarm whistle sounded unnaturally loud, and the yacht made a frightful pitch, overturning Wilson, who was at the wheel, by an unexpected blow from the tiller. The Duncan no longer obeyed the helm. What is the matter? Cried the captain, rushing on the bridge. The ship is heeling over on her side, replied Wilson. The engine, shouted the engineer. Away rushed John to the engine room. A cloud of steam filled the room. The pistons were motionless in their cylinders, and they were apparently powerless, and the engine driver, fearing for his boilers, was letting off the steam. What's wrong? Asked the captain. The propeller is bent or entangled, was the reply. It's not acting at all. Can't you extricate it? It is impossible. An accident like this could not be remedied, and John's only resource was to fall back on his sails and seek to make an auxiliary of his most powerful enemy, the wind. He went up again on deck, and after explaining in a few words to Lord Glenarvan how things stood, begged him to retire to his cabin with the rest of the passengers. But Glenarvan wished to remain above. "No, your lordship," said the captain in a firm tone, "I must be alone with my men. Go into the saloon. The vessel will have a hard fight with the waves, and they would sweep you over without mercy. But we might be a help." "Go in, my lord, go in. I must indeed insist on it. There are times when I must be master on board, and retire you must." Their situation must indeed be desperate for John Mangles to speak in such authoritative language. Glenarvan was wise enough to understand this, and felt he must set an example in obedience. He therefore quitted the deck immediately with his three companions, and rejoined the ladies, who were anxiously watching the denouement of this war with the elements. "He's an energetic fellow, this brave John of mine," said Lord Glenarvan as he entered the saloon. "That he is," replied Paganel. "He reminds me of your great Shakespeare's boatswain in The Tempest, who says to the king on board, 'Hence, what care these roarers for the name of king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not.'" However, John Mangles did not lose a second in extricating his ship from the peril in which she was placed by the condition of her screw propeller. He resolved to rely on the mainsail for keeping in the right route as far as possible, and to brace the yards obliquely so as not to present a direct front to the storm. The yacht turned about like a swift horse that feels the spur, and presented a broadside to the billows. The only question was, how long would she hold out with so little sail, and what sail could resist such violence for any length of time? The great advantage of keeping up the mainsail was that it presented to the waves only the most solid portions of the yacht, and kept her in the right course. Still, it involved some peril, for the vessel might get engulfed between the waves and not be able to raise herself. But Mangles felt there was no alternative, and all he could do was to keep the crew ready to alter the sail at any moment and stay in the shrouds himself watching the tempest. The remainder of the night was spent in this manner, and it was hoped that morning would bring a calm. But this was a delusive hope. At 8 a.m. the wind had increased to a hurricane. John said nothing, but he trembled for his ship and those on board. The Duncan made a frightful plunge forward, and for an instant the men thought she would never rise again. Already they had seized their hatchets to cut away the shrouds from the mainmast, but the next minute the sails were torn away by the tempest and had flown off like gigantic albatrosses. The yacht had risen once more, but she found herself at the mercy of the waves entirely now, with nothing to steady or direct her, and was so fearfully pitched and tossed about that every moment the captain expected the masts would break short off. John had no resource but to put up a forestaysail and run before the gale. But this was no easy task. 20 times over he had all his work to begin again, and it was 3 p.m. before his attempt succeeded. A mere shred of canvas though it was enough to drive the Duncan forward with inconceivable rapidity to the northeast, of course in the same direction as the hurricane. Swiftness was their only chance of safety. Sometimes she would get in advance of the waves which carried her along, and cutting through them with her sharp prow, bury herself in their depths. At others, she would keep pace with them, and make such enormous leaps that there was imminent danger of her being pitched over on her side. And then again, every now and then the storm-driven sea would outdistance the yacht, and the angry billows would sweep over the deck from stem to stern with tremendous violence. In this alarming situation and amid dreadful alternations of hope and despair, the 12th of December passed away, and the ensuing night John Mangles never left his post, not even to take food. Though his impassive face betrayed no symptoms of fear, he was tortured with anxiety, and his steady gaze was fixed on the north, as if trying to pierce through the thick mists that enshrouded it. There was, indeed, great cause for fear. The Duncan was out of her course, and rushing toward the Australian coast with a speed which nothing could lessen. To John Mangles it seemed as if a thunderbolt were driving them along. Every instant he expected the yacht would dash against some rock, for he reckoned the coast could not be more than 12 miles off, and better far be in mid-ocean exposed to all its fury than too near land. John Mangles went to find Glenarvan, and had a private talk with him about their situation, telling him frankly the true state of affairs, stating the case with all the coolness of a sailor prepared for anything and everything, and he wound up by saying he might, perhaps, be obliged to cast the yacht on shore. "To save the lives of those on board, my lord," he added. "Do it then, John," replied Lord Glenarvan. "And Lady Helena, Miss Grant?" I will tell them at the last moment when all hope of keeping out at sea is over. You will let me know? I will, my lord. Glenarvan rejoined his companions, who felt they were in imminent danger, though no word was spoken on the subject. Both ladies displayed great courage, fully equal to any of the party. Paganel descanted in the most inopportune manner about the direction of atmospheric currents, making interesting comparisons between tornadoes, cyclones, and rectilinear tempests. The Major calmly awaited the end with the fatalism of a Mussulman. About 11 o'clock, the hurricane appeared to decrease slightly. The damp mist began to clear away, and a sudden gleam of light revealed a low-lying shore about 6 miles distant. They were driving right down on it. Enormous breakers 50 feet high were dashing over it, and the fact of their height showed John there must be solid ground before they could make such a rebound. "Those are sandbanks," he said to Austin. "I think they are," replied the mate. "We are in God's hands," said John. "If we cannot find any opening for the yacht, and if she doesn't find the way in herself, we are lost. The tide is high at present. It is just possible we may ride over those sandbanks. But just see those breakers. What ship could stand them? Let us invoke divine aid, Austin." Meanwhile, the Duncan was speeding on at a frightful rate. Soon she was within 2 miles of the sandbanks, which were still veiled from time to time in thick mist. But John fancied he could see beyond the breakers a quiet basin, where the Duncan would be in comparative safety. But how could she reach it? All the passengers were summoned on deck, for now that the hour of shipwreck was at hand, the captain did not wish anyone to be shut up in his cabin. "John," said Glenarvan in a low voice to the captain, "I will try to save my wife or perish with her. I put Miss Grant in your charge." "Yes, my lord," replied John Mangles, raising Glenarvan's hand to his moistened eyes. The yacht was only a few cables' lengths from the sandbanks. The tide was high, and no doubt there was abundance of water to float the ship over the dangerous bar. But these terrific breakers alternately lifting her up and then leaving her almost dry would infallibly make her graze the sandbanks. Was there no means of calming this angry sea? A last expedient struck the captain. "The oil, my lads," he exclaimed. "Bring the oil here." The crew caught at the idea immediately. This was a plan that had been successfully tried already. The fury of the waves had been allayed before this time by covering them with a sheet of oil. Its effect is immediate but very temporary. The moment after a ship has passed over the smooth surface, the sea redoubles its violence, and woe to the bark that follows. The casks of seal oil were forthwith hauled up, for danger seemed to have given the men double strength. A few hatchet blows soon knocked in the heads, and they were then hung over the larboard and starboard. "Be ready," shouted John, looking out for a favorable moment. In 20 seconds the yacht reached the bar. Now was the time. "Pour out," cried the captain, "and God prosper it." The barrels were turned upside down, and instantly a sheet of oil covered the whole surface of the water. The billows fell as if by magic, the whole foaming sea seemed leveled, and the Duncan flew over its tranquil bosom into a quiet basin beyond the formidable bar. But almost the same minute the ocean burst forth again with all its fury, and the towering breakers dashed over the bar with increased violence. Chapter 6: A Hospitable Colonist. The captain's first care was to anchor his vessel securely. He found excellent moorage in 5 fathoms depth of water, with a solid bottom of hard granite, which afforded a firm hold. There was no danger now of either being driven away or stranded at low water. After so many hours of danger, the Duncan found herself in a sort of creek, sheltered by a high circular point from the winds outside in the open sea. Lord Glenarvan grasped John Mangles' hand and simply said, "Thank you, John." This was all, but John felt it ample recompense. Glenarvan kept to himself the secret of his anxiety, and neither Lady Helena, nor Mary, nor Robert suspected the grave perils they had just escaped. One important fact had to be ascertained. On what part of the coast had the tempest thrown them? How far must they go to regain the parallel? At what distance SW was Cape Bernouilli? This was soon determined by taking the position of the ship, and it was found that she had scarcely deviated 2 degrees from the route. They were in longitude 36 degrees 12 minutes and latitude 32 degrees 67 minutes at Cape Catastrophe, 300 miles from Cape Bernouilli. The nearest port was Adelaide, the capital of southern Australia. Could the Duncan be repaired there? This was the question. The extent of the injuries must first be ascertained, and in order to do this, he ordered some of the men to dive down below the stern. Their report was that one of the branches of the screw was bent and had got jammed against the stern post, which of course prevented all possibility of rotation. This was a serious damage, so serious as to require more skillful workmen than could be found in Adelaide. After mature reflection, Lord Glenarvan and John Mangles came to the determination to sail round the Australian coast, stopping at Cape Bernouilli, and continuing their route south as far as Melbourne, where the Duncan could speedily be put right. This effected, they would proceed to cruise along the eastern coast to complete their search for the Britannia. This decision was unanimously approved, and it was agreed that they should start with the first fair wind. They had not to wait long, for the same night the hurricane had ceased entirely, and there was only a manageable breeze from the SW. Preparations for sailing were instantly commenced, and at 4 o'clock in the morning the crew lifted the anchors and got under way with fresh canvas outspread, and a wind blowing right for the Australian shores. 2 hours afterward Cape Catastrophe was out of sight. In the evening they doubled Cape Borda and came alongside Kangaroo Island. This is the largest of the Australian islands and a great hiding place for runaway convicts. Its appearance was enchanting. The stratified rocks on the shore were richly carpeted with verdure, and innumerable kangaroos were jumping over the woods and plains, just as at the time of its discovery in 1802. Next day, boats were sent ashore to examine the coast minutely, as they were now on the 36th parallel, and between that and the 38th Glenarvan wished to leave no part unexplored. The boats had hard, rough work of it now, but the men never complained. Glenarvan and his inseparable companion, Paganel, and young Robert generally accompanied them, but all this painstaking exploration came to nothing. Not a trace of the shipwreck could be seen anywhere. The Australian shores revealed no more than the Patagonian. However, it was not time yet to lose hope altogether, for they had not reached the exact point indicated by the document. On the 20th of December, they arrived off Cape Bernouilli, which terminates Laspeed Bay, and yet not a vestige of the Britannia had been discovered. Still, this was not surprising, as it was 2 years since the occurrence of the catastrophe, and the sea might, and indeed must, have scattered and destroyed whatever fragments of the brig had remained. Besides, the natives who scent a wreck as the vultures do a dead body would have pounced upon it and carried off the smaller debris. There was no doubt whatever Harry Grant and his companions had been made prisoners the moment the waves threw them on the shore, and been dragged away into the interior of the continent. But if so, what becomes of Paganel's ingenious hypothesis about the document, viz., that it had been thrown into a river and carried by a current into the sea? That was a plausible enough theory in Patagonia, but not in the part of Australia intersected by the 37th parallel. Besides, the Patagonian rivers, the Rio Colorado and the Rio Negro, flow into the sea along deserted solitudes, uninhabited and uninhabitable, while, on the contrary, the principal rivers of Australia, the Murray, the Yarrow, the Torrens, the Darling, all connected with each other, throw themselves into the ocean by well-frequented routes, and their mouths are ports of great activity. What likelihood, consequently, would there be that a fragile bottle would ever find its way, along such busy thoroughfares, right out into the Indian Ocean? Paganel himself saw the impossibility of it, and confessed to the Major, who raised a discussion on the subject, that his hypothesis would be altogether illogical in Australia. It was evident that the degrees given related to the place where the Britannia was actually shipwrecked, and not the place of captivity, and that the bottle therefore had been thrown into the sea on the western coast of the continent. However, as Glenarvan justly remarked, this did not alter the fact of Captain Grant's captivity in the least degree, though there was no reason now for prosecuting the search for him along the 37th parallel, more than any other. It followed, consequently, that if no traces of the Britannia were discovered at Cape Bernouilli, the only thing to be done was to return to Europe. Lord Glenarvan would have been unsuccessful, but he would have done his duty courageously and conscientiously. But the young Grants did not feel disheartened. They had long since said to themselves that the question of their father's deliverance was about to be finally settled. Irrevocably, indeed, they might consider it, for as Paganel had judiciously demonstrated, if the wreck had occurred on the eastern side, the survivors would have found their way back to their own country long since. Hope on, Mary," said Lady Helena to the young girl as they neared the shore. "God's hand will still lead us." "Yes, Miss Mary," said Captain John, "man's extremity is God's opportunity. When one way is hedged up, another is sure to open." "God grant it," replied Mary. Land was quite close now. The cape ran out 2 miles into the sea, and terminated in a gentle slope, and the boat glided easily into a sort of natural creek between coral banks in a state of formation, which in course of time would be a belt of coral reefs round the southern point of the Australian coast. Even now they were quite sufficiently formidable to destroy the keel of a ship, and the Britannia might likely enough have been dashed to pieces on them. The passengers landed without the least difficulty on an absolutely desert shore. Cliffs composed of beds of strata made a coastline 60 to 80 feet high, which it would have been difficult to scale without ladders or cramp irons. John Mangles happened to discover a natural breach about half a mile south. Part of the cliff had been partially beaten down, no doubt, by the sea in some equinoctial gale. Through this opening the whole party passed and reached the top of the cliff by a pretty steep path. Robert climbed like a young cat, and was the first on the summit, to the despair of Paganel, who was quite ashamed to see his long legs, 40 years old, outdistanced by a young urchin of 12. However, he was far ahead of the major, who gave himself no concern on the subject. They were all soon assembled on the lofty crags, and from this elevation could command a view of the whole plain below. It appeared entirely uncultivated, and covered with shrubs and bushes. Glenarvan thought it resembled some glens in the lowlands of Scotland, and Paganel fancied it like some barren parts of Brittany. But along the coast the country appeared to be inhabited, and significant signs of industry revealed the presence of civilized men, not savages. "A mill!" exclaimed Robert. And sure enough, in the distance the long sails of a mill appeared, apparently about 3 miles off. "It certainly is a windmill," said Paganel, after examining the object in question through his telescope. "Let us go to it then," said Glenarvan. Away they started, and after walking about half an hour, the country began to assume a new aspect, suddenly changing its sterility for cultivation. Instead of bushes, quickset hedges met the eye, enclosing recent clearings. Several bullocks and about half a dozen horses were feeding in meadows, surrounded by acacias supplied from the vast plantations of Kangaroo Island. Gradually fields covered with cereals came in sight, whole acres covered with bristling ears of corn, hayricks in the shape of large beehives, blooming orchards, a fine garden worthy of Horace in which the useful and agreeable were blended. Then came sheds, commons wisely distributed, and last of all, a plain, comfortable dwelling house, crowned by a joyous-sounding mill, and fanned and shaded by its long sails as they kept constantly moving round. Just at that moment a pleasant-faced man, about 50 years of age, came out of the house, warned by the loud barking of 4 dogs of the arrival of strangers. He was followed by 5 handsome strapping lads, his sons and their mother, a fine tall woman. There was no mistaking the little group. This was a perfect type of the Irish colonist, a man who, weary of the miseries of his country, had come, with his family, to seek fortune and happiness beyond the seas. Before Glenarvan and his party had time to reach the house and present themselves in due form, they heard the cordial words, "Strangers, welcome to the house of Paddy O'Moore." "You are Irish," said Glenarvan, "if I am not mistaken," warmly grasping the outstretched hand of the colonist. "I was," replied Paddy O'Moore, "but now I am Australian. Come in, gentlemen, whoever you may be, this house is yours." It was impossible not to accept an invitation, given with such grace. Lady Helena and Mary Grant were led in by Mrs. O'Moore, while the gentlemen were assisted by his sturdy sons to disencumber themselves of their firearms. An immense hall, light and airy, occupied the ground floor of the house, which was built of strong planks laid horizontally. A few wooden benches fastened against the gaily colored walls, about 10 stools, 2 oak chests on tin mugs, a large long table where 20 guests could sit comfortably, composed the furniture, which looked in perfect keeping with the solid house and robust inmates. The noonday meal was spread. The soup tureen was smoking between roast beef and a leg of mutton, surrounded by large plates of olives, grapes, and oranges. The necessary was there, and there was no lack of the superfluous. The host and hostess were so pleasant, and the big table with its abundant fare looked so inviting that it would have been ungracious not to have seated themselves. The farm servants, on equal footing with their master, were already in their places to take their share of the meal. Paddy O'Moore pointed to the seats reserved for the strangers, and said to Glenarvan, "I was waiting for you." "Waiting for us?" replied Glenarvan in a tone of surprise. "I am always waiting for those who come," said the Irishman, and then, in a solemn voice, while the family and domestics reverently stood, he repeated the benedicite. Dinner followed immediately, during which an animated conversation was kept up on all sides. From Scotch to Irish is but a handsbreadth. The Tweed, several fathoms wide, digs a deeper trench between Scotland and England than the 20 leagues of Irish Channel, which separates Old Caledonia from the Emerald Isle. Paddy O'Moore related his history. It was that of all emigrants driven by misfortune from their own country. Many come to seek fortunes who only find trouble and sorrow, and then they throw the blame on chance and forget the true cause is their own idleness and vice and want of common sense. Whoever is sober and industrious, honest and economical, gets on. Such a one had been and was Paddy O'Moore. He left Dundalk, where he was starving, and came with his family to Australia, landed at Adelaide, where, refusing employment as a miner, he got engaged on a farm, and 2 months afterward commenced clearing ground on his own account. The whole territory of South Australia is divided into lots, each containing 80 acres, and these are granted to colonists by the government. Any industrious man, by proper cultivation, can not only get a living out of his lot, but lay by £80 a year. Paddy O'Moore knew this. He profited by his own former experience and laid by every penny he could till he had saved enough to purchase new lots. His family prospered, and his farm also. The Irish peasant became a landed proprietor, and though his little estate had only been under cultivation for 2 years, he had 500 acres cleared by his own hands and 500 head of cattle. He was his own master, after having been a serf in Europe, and as independent as one can be in the freest country in the world. His guests congratulated him heartily as he ended his narration, and Paddy O'Moore no doubt expected confidence for confidence, but he waited in vain. However, he was one of those discreet people who can say, "I tell you who I am, but I don't ask who you are." Glenarvan's great object was to get information about the Britannia, and like a man who goes right to the point, he began at once to interrogate O'Moore as to whether he had heard of the shipwreck. The reply of the Irishman was not favorable. He had never heard the vessel mentioned. For 2 years at least, no ship had been wrecked on that coast, neither above nor below the Cape. Now, the date of the catastrophe was within 2 years. He could, therefore, declare positively that the survivors of the wreck had not been thrown on that part of the western shore. "Now, my lord," he added, "may I ask what interest you have in making the inquiry?" This pointed question elicited in reply the whole history of the expedition. Glenarvan related the discovery of the document and the various attempts that had been made to follow up the precise indications given of the whereabouts of the unfortunate captives, and he concluded his account by expressing his doubt whether they should ever find the captain after all. His dispirited tone made a painful impression on the minds of his auditors. Robert and Mary could not keep back their tears, and Paganel had not a word of hope or comfort to give them. John Mangles was grieved to the heart, though he, too, was beginning to yield to the feeling of hopelessness which had crept over the rest, when suddenly the whole party were electrified by hearing a voice exclaim, "My lord, praise and thank God. If Captain Grant is alive, he is on this Australian continent." Chapter 7: The Quartermaster of the Britannia. The surprise caused by these words cannot be described. Glenarvan sprang to his feet and pushing back his seat, exclaimed, "Who spoke?" "I did," said one of the servants at the far end of the table. "You, Ayrton?" replied his master, not less bewildered than Glenarvan. "Yes, it was I," rejoined Ayrton in a firm tone, though somewhat agitated voice. "A Scotchman like yourself, my lord, and one of the shipwrecked crew of the Britannia." The effect of such a declaration may be imagined. Mary Grant fell back, half fainting, in Lady Helena's arms, overcome by joyful emotion, and Robert and Mangles, and Paganel started up and toward the man that Paddy O'Moore had addressed as Ayrton. He was a coarse-looking fellow, about 45 years of age, with very bright eyes, though half hidden beneath thick, overhanging brows. In spite of extreme leanness, there was an air of unusual strength about him. He seemed all bone and nerves, or, to use a Scotch expression, as if he had not wasted time in making fat. He was broad-shouldered and of middle height, and though his features were coarse, his face was so full of intelligence and energy and decision that he gave one a favorable impression. The interest he excited was still further heightened by the marks of recent suffering imprinted on his countenance. It was evident that he had endured long and severe hardships, and that he had borne them bravely and come off victor. "You are one of the shipwrecked sailors of the Britannia?" was Glenarvan's first question. "Yes, my lord, Captain Grant's quartermaster." "And saved with him after the shipwreck?" "No, my lord, no. I was separated from him at that terrible moment, for I was swept off the deck as the ship struck." "Then, you are not one of the 2 sailors mentioned in the document?" "No, I was not aware of the existence of the document. The captain must have thrown it into the sea when I was no longer on board. But the captain, what about the captain? I believed he had perished, gone down with all his crew. I imagined myself the sole survivor. But you said just now, Captain Grant was living. No, I said, if the captain is living. And you added, he is on the Australian continent. And indeed, he cannot be anywhere else. Then you don't know where he is. No, my lord, I say again, I supposed he was buried beneath the waves or dashed to pieces against the rocks. It was from you I learned that he was still alive. What then do you know? Simply this, if Captain Grant is alive, he is in Australia. Where did the shipwreck occur? Asked Major McNabbs. This should have been the first question, but in the excitement caused by the unexpected incident, Glenarvan cared more to know where the captain was than where the Britannia had been lost. After the Major's inquiry, however, Glenarvan's examination proceeded more logically, and before long all the details of the event stood out clearly before the minds of the company. To the question put by the Major, Ayrton replied, "When I was swept off the forecastle, when I was hauling in the jib boom, the Britannia was running right on the Australian coast. She was not more than 2 cables' length from it, and consequently she must have struck just there." "In latitude 37 degrees?" asked John Mangles. "Yes, in latitude 37 degrees." "On the west coast?" "No, on the east coast," was the prompt reply. "And at what date?" "It was on the night of the 27th of June, 1862. "Exactly, just exactly," exclaimed Glenarvan. "You see then, my lord," continued Ayrton, "I might justly say, if Captain Grant is alive, he is on the Australian continent, and it is useless looking for him anywhere else." "And we will look for him there and find him too, and save him?" exclaimed Paganel. "Ah, precious document," he added, with perfect naivete, "you must own you have fallen into the hands of uncommonly shrewd people." But doubtless nobody heard his flattering words, for Glenarvan and Lady Helena and Mary Grant and Robert were too much engrossed with Ayrton to listen to anyone else. They pressed round him and grasped his hands. It seemed as if this man's presence was the sure pledge of Harry Grant's deliverance. If this sailor had escaped the perils of the shipwreck, why should not the captain? Ayrton was quite sanguine as to his existence, but on what part of the continent he was to be found, that he could not say. The replies the man gave to the 1,000 questions that assailed him on all sides were remarkably intelligent and exact. All the while he spake, Mary held one of his hands in hers. This sailor was a companion of her father's, one of the crew of the Britannia. He had lived with Harry Grant, crossed the seas with him, and shared his dangers. Mary could not keep her eyes off his face, rough and homely though it was, and she wept for joy. Up to this time, no one had ever thought of doubting either the veracity or identity of the quartermaster. But the Major, and perhaps John Mangles, now began to ask themselves if this Ayrton's word was to be absolutely believed. There was something suspicious about this unexpected meeting. Certainly the man had mentioned facts and dates which corresponded, and the minuteness of his details was most striking. Still, exactness of details was no positive proof. Indeed, it has been noticed that a falsehood has sometimes gained ground by being exceedingly particular in minutiae. McNabbs, therefore, prudently refrained from committing himself by expressing any opinion. John Mangles, however, was soon convinced when he heard Ayrton speak to the young girl about her father. He knew Mary and Robert quite well. He had seen them in Glasgow when the ship sailed. He remembered them at the farewell breakfast given on board the Britannia to the captain's friends, at which Sheriff McIntyre was present. Robert, then a boy of 10 years old, had been given into his charge, and he ran away and tried to climb the rigging. "Yes, that I did, it is quite right," said Robert. He went on to mention several other trifling incidents, without attaching the importance to them that John Mangles did, and when he stopped, Mary Grant said, in her soft voice, "Oh, go on, Mr. Ayrton, tell us more about our father." The quartermaster did his best to satisfy the poor girl, and Glenarvan did not interrupt him, though a score of questions far more important crowded into his mind. Lady Helena made him look at Mary's beaming face, and the words he was about to utter remained unspoken. Ayrton gave an account of the Britannia's voyage across the Pacific. Mary knew most of it before, as news of the ship had come regularly up to the month of May, 1862. In the course of the year, Harry Grant had touched at all the principal ports. He had been to the Hebrides, to New Guinea, New Zealand, and New Caledonia, and had succeeded in finding an important point on the western coast of Papua, where the establishment of a Scotch colony seemed to him easy, and its prosperity certain. A good port on the Malacca and Philippine route must attract ships, especially when the opening of the Suez Canal would have supplanted the Cape route. Harry Grant was one of those who appreciated the great work of M. de Lesseps and would not allow political rivalries to interfere with international interests. After reconnoitering Papua, the Britannia went to provision herself at Callao and left that port on the 30th of May, 1862, to return to Europe by the Indian Ocean and the Cape. 3 weeks afterward, his vessel was disabled by a fearful storm in which they were caught and obliged to cut away the masts. A leak sprang in the hold and could not be stopped. The crew were too exhausted to work the pumps, and for 8 days the Britannia was tossed about in the hurricane like a shuttlecock. She had 6 feet of water in her hold and was gradually sinking. The boats had been all carried away by the tempest. Death stared them in the face, when, on the night of the 22nd of June, as Paganel had rightly supposed, they came in sight of the eastern coast of Australia. The ship soon neared the shore, and presently dashed violently against it. Ayrton was swept off by a wave and thrown among the breakers, where he lost consciousness. When he recovered, he found himself in the hands of natives, who dragged him away into the interior of the country. Since that time he had never heard the Britannia's name mentioned, and reasonably enough came to the conclusion that she had gone down with all hands off the dangerous reefs of Twofold Bay. This ended Ayrton's recital, and more than once sorrowful exclamations were evoked by the story. The Major could not, in common justice, doubt its authenticity. The sailor was then asked to narrate his own personal history, which was short and simple enough. He had been carried by a tribe of natives 400 miles north of the 37th parallel. He spent a miserable existence there. Not that he was ill-treated, but the natives themselves lived miserably. He passed 2 long years of painful slavery among them, but always cherished in his heart the hope of one day regaining his freedom, and watching for the slightest opportunity that might turn up, though he knew that his flight would be attended with innumerable dangers. At length one night in October, 1864, he managed to escape the vigilance of the natives, and took refuge in the depths of immense forests. For a whole month he subsisted on roots, edible ferns, and mimosa gums, wandering through vast solitudes, guiding himself by the sun during the day and by the stars at night. He went on, though often almost despairingly, through bogs and rivers and across mountains, till he had traversed the whole of the uninhabited part of the continent, where only a few bold travelers have ventured. And at last, in an exhausted and all but dying condition, he reached the hospitable dwelling of Paddy O'Moore, where he said he had found a happy home in exchange for his labor. "And if Ayrton speaks well of me," said the Irish settler when the narrative ended, "I have nothing but good to say of him. He is an honest, intelligent fellow and a good worker, and as long as he pleases, Paddy O'Moore's house shall be his." Ayrton thanked him by a gesture, and waited silently for any fresh question that might be put to him, though he thought to himself that he surely must have satisfied all legitimate curiosity. What could remain to be said that he had not said 100 times already? Glenarvan was just about to open a discussion about their future plan of action, profiting by this rencontre with Ayrton, and by the information he had given them, when Major McNabbs, addressing the sailor, said, "You were quartermaster, you say, on the Britannia?" "Yes," replied Ayrton, without the least hesitation. But as if conscious that a certain feeling of mistrust, however slight, had prompted the inquiry, he added, "I have my shipping papers with me. I saved them from the wreck." He left the room immediately to fetch his official document, and though hardly absent a minute, Paddy O'Moore managed to say, "My lord, you may trust Ayrton. I vouch for his being an honest man. He has been 2 months now in my service, and I have never had once to find fault with him. I knew all this story of his shipwreck and his captivity. He is a true man, worthy of your entire confidence." Glenarvan was on the point of replying that he had never doubted his good faith, when the man came in and brought his engagement written out in due form. It was a paper signed by the shipowners and Captain Grant. Mary recognized her father's writing at once. It was to certify that Tom Ayrton, able-bodied seaman, was engaged as quartermaster on board the 3-mast vessel, the Britannia, Glasgow. There could not possibly be the least doubt now of Ayrton's identity, for it would have been difficult to account for his possession of the document if he were not the man named in it. "Now then," said Glenarvan, I wish to ask everyone's opinion as to what is best to be done. Your advice, Ayrton, will be particularly valuable, and I shall be much obliged if you would let us have it. After a few minutes' thought, Ayrton replied, I thank you, my lord, for the confidence you show towards me, and I hope to prove worthy of it. I have some knowledge of the country and the habits of the natives, and if I can be of any service to you. Most certainly you can, interrupted Glenarvan. I think with you, resumed Ayrton, that the captain and his two sailors have escaped alive from the wreck, but since they have not found their way to the English settlement, nor been seen anywhere, I have no doubt that their fate has been similar to my own, and that they are prisoners in the hands of some of the native tribes. That's exactly what I have always argued, said Paganel. The shipwrecked men were taken prisoners, as they feared, but must we conclude without question that, like yourself, they have been dragged away north of the 37th parallel?